Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Good morning, Dr. Rapici. How are you today?
Good morning, Barry. I'm well. How are you?
I am well. We are here today, yet again, in the Zoom stream, talking to our listeners, in this case, about literature. We're continuing our literary moment. Although we're also, in this episode, as we discussed, we are going into this episode, going into this conversation, we think of it, even though we're going to be talking about, and let me name it, Philip K. Dick's novel, 1968 novel, the inspiration for the Blade Runner films, as the title page tells me. Philip K. Dick's novel, 1968 novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The inspiration for the Blade Runner films, which perhaps our listeners, viewers, as such, friends of the podcast are familiar with. And even though we're going to be talking about PKD's book, in many ways, Michael and I, in our preliminary discussion, noted that we also think of this book and our discussion of this book as something of a part two, a concluding commentary on our last podcast, where we discussed Sherry Turkle's book, Alone. What was it called? Alone Together.
Alone Together. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is, the way I'm looking at this is really sort of as an answer or a challenge or a what if to Turkle's argument that one of the key distinctions between humans and robots is that humans can show emotion, whereas any robot can merely mimic emotion algorithmically.
And therefore, there's an implicit hierarchy in Turkle, right?
Right.
Or certainly, I guess at bottom, in the end, rather, there's a clear hierarchy or a possible hierarchy because there's a pretty clear dividing line. One
Turkle.
Species, well, yeah, for Turkle. One species doesn't have emotions, has the algorithm, and the other species has emotional subjectivity. So, I mean, is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I think, well, that's how I think Turkle's understanding of the divide exists. And I think that what we get with PKD is obviously it's science fiction, but a different telling that, raises some interesting questions.
Indeed. Interesting questions. Is that not that's almost a euphemism, is it not, Dr. Rapici? Because these are interesting questions, thorny questions, and PKD sort of emphasizes, I think it's fair to say that while he emphasizes their thorniness, but maybe a better way of putting it is, while this novel explores the question of the human android divide, it leaves that question pretty much unanswered and unresolved, and for the reader to sort of ponder for themselves.
Yeah, the other thing, and I think maybe it's probably helpful to lay a little bit of groundwork here.
I want to say something about literary history in PKD very quickly.
Go ahead.
So no. Do yours.
Well, I was going to say, the thing that I think is interesting
scene setting
is that, Turkle's argument, if you back up just a little bit, is that we have sort of a contradictory relationship with our technology. And that is that the more heavily, so with the idea that robots cannot generate an emotional response, that they are merely capable of mimicking something that looks like emotion. And then the big sell there is for humans to accept an algorithmic representation, an algorithmically derived representation as an authentic thing.
Indeed.
Right. The irony here is that the more heavily we lean into our technologies for emotional support, the more divided we become, the more isolated we become. And so
that's Turkle's argument.
This is Turkle. The argument that she's putting forth, I think, is that we are essentially in a downward spiral where we become more alienated. So what's the answer to alienation? More technology to try and get us to accept an inauthentic, an unauthentic
Mhm.
um, facsimile
Mhm.
of emotion or emotional connection. So when we get to, and I'm going to just say this, and I'll let you do the history lesson for us.
It'll be
Um,
very quick.
when we get to PKD and androids, we have a world that sort of picks up where Turkle imagines that we are, in the sense
Hmm.
that, you have humans relying on the empathy boxes. There doesn't seem to be a ton of actual interaction. We have,
Between humans, or
yes,
that,
among
yeah,
humans.
right.
And we have obviously a society very heavily dependent
Mhm.
on um, robotic things.
Right.
So what's
In order, very heavily reliant, I'm just going to fill out that
right?
sentence if I may, heavily reliant on robots and robotic logic because of a pre-existing lack
Yes,
in the human and in human relationships, and a perceived lack in human relationships.
exactly. So we have a situation, and I think this is the reason why this was such an appealing topic after Turkle. Was It's almost as if, despite the fact that, I mean, this is set in the far off future year of our
Of
Lord.
2000, 2020.
So
Right? It's
it's
2020.
20 or 21. I thought for some
Yeah,
reason I thought it was 20, but
it
the
could be
argument,
21.
the fact is that Turkle wrote, I think Alone Together was 2010. So it still is a futuristic rendering, and we can get creative. But the
But
idea
written
is
in 1968.
right. But
That's our point.
what's fascinating to me, though, is that he imagined what she saw. And the thing that's interesting is that the machines are not in his vision, in PKD's vision. The machines certainly are responsible for
Mhm.
doing manual labor, things that would be physically dangerous. So they certainly check the utilitarian box. But
Mhm.
we also have very personal things. The empathy box. Mercer's religion has been
The religion of Mercer.
roboticized.
Right. Right.
Empathy has been roboticized. So he is, I think, a really interesting imagined next step.
Mhm. And a kind of bridge, as you're pointing out, to the Turkle discussion. Well, do you want to say more, or
No,
I'll
I'm good.
just
I
do the
think
quick?
I'm ready for your
Well, I'm
contextual
just going
briefing, and we'll
to
go.
I'm just going to do the briefest of nods, and I really will try to keep it brief. The briefest of nods, because we could get lost in this, but I'm going to try not to. The briefest of nods to literary history, and just to say that in this novel, and I guess we should say something. You'll do a better job of this than me, because I certainly would get digressive. We need to say something about the plot setup or the backstory for the particular world, futuristic world that PKD describes in Do Androids. But I just wanted to make a nod to literary history in particular. Um, uh, I wanted to talk about how the overall theme of this book, the overall question the novel explores, relates to PKD's other books. Philip K. Dick was a extremely prolific and wildly imaginative um, science fiction writer, mainly working in the 60s and 70s, but very prolific and distinguished among science fiction writers for the eerily prophetic nature of his futuristic visions. So his imaginative tales definitely had this quality of prophecy. And there is a general problem that PKD works out over the course of his novels. And I can name a lot of novels where he's exploring this larger theme. And one way of understanding, I think, kind of a necessary preamble to a discussion of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is that it asks a particular question that is very clearly related to an overarching question that PKD asks and explores and investigates in a whole ton of other books. Okay, so what's the question that I think we're going to be talking about today that is posed in the form of fiction, in a narrative form. Um, this is a narrative. I'll put it another way. PKD is setting up a narrative that explores the question in representing humans and androids and in their interactions. PKD sets up in this particular novel. He explores the larger question of what makes humans different from androids, if anything. What, if anything, makes humans different from androids? And what is there a hierarchical relation between these two different quote unquote species? Is there a difference that's not really a difference? Is there a difference that's not a true distinction? Is that the point of the comparison that the novel presents? Or, he's worrying about this question, this category question, about this category. He's worrying about a fundamental category question. What is the distinction or difference, if any, between the human world, between human consciousness and android consciousness? And one last thing. That's the particular question I think the novel revolves around and investigates. And I just wanted to mention that PKD's incredibly influential question, this is related to a question or a topic that animates so much of his fiction. And that larger question, I would try to summarize it this way. It's the question it's a philosophical question of what constitutes the real, and what is the distinction between the real and the simulation, the real and an imitation, the authentic and its mimicry. So that's the larger. So we were talking about this before the show. So this before our recording, PKD, PKD's novel, of course, is the precursor, is the prototype for the Ridley Scott film Blade Runner. But in many ways, PKD's work on the whole offers the template for what has become an its own subgenre of sci-fi, kind of dystopian fiction that it's the plot of the Matrix as well, the narrative form of the Matrix as well, which is a narrative form that has almost colonized, right? It was almost taken over science fiction, so that most of our science fiction stories has this particular form. It has the form of a dystopian vision of society, number one. And also it's exploring, as the Matrix does, it's exploring the general philosophical question, yet again, of the nature of reality as opposed to unreality or artifice or simulation. And that's, of course, the abiding question of the Matrix. And we have another version of that question explored in this particular novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?
Right. No, I think that's good. So maybe those are the questions we should try and chase down a little bit. And so,
okay, Michael, because you'll do this a lot better than I tried to be brief, and what did I eat up? 10 minutes, 15 minutes? I don't know, but several minutes. So I know you'll do a better job of this. I think before we go into the discussion and try to answer these questions, we need to, and I'm looking to you to do this because you were already doing it in our pre-taping. You were giving a very good rundown, a very concise background of like the world of this novel. Like, what's the setup for this novel?
I'll try. I think that we can merge the two together into a discussion, though, so that I don't have to yammer on.
That's even better. That's even better.
The first question that PKD is dealing with, the primary question here, right, is what's the difference between human and the robotic, right? The android and the human.
The human and the robotic, yeah.
And so to take a quick step back, right, Turkle says that's simple. That's the ability to genuinely, authentically emote, right? And so this notion of authenticity, or what's genuine, what's real, what's a facsimile of this, that's lurking here in this discussion as well. So the basic version of the story is you've got a
We've had a nuclear war.
There has been a world war.
And we have a radiation infested Earth.
And the results of that war are this toxic dust. And as a result of this global toxic dust, set in San Francisco, right? But this is a global issue. much of the population has emigrated to Mars.
Right.
And the,
Interestingly enough, can I just add something to that?
yeah,
A little detail to that that tells you that may be really kind of prescient and is kind of crypto fascist or sort of. I think Dick is sort of um, um, implying the crypto fascist nature of the world, the society that he represents. One of the reasons for the Mars colonization, did you catch this? One of the reasons for the Mars colonization, one of the reasons why humans are encouraged by the government to go to Mars is to maintain the purity of the human strain, right? Because of
it's
the
true. Yeah,
environment,
with
right?
the derogatory,
So,
the chicken heads.
right. So, you know, right, exactly. So there is not so crypto. I was about to say crypto fascist, but not
No.
really even very crypto. There's a kind of concern about so already in isolating the human and encouraging human migration,
It has to be
there's
a
a sense
pure human.
that it's going to yes, and that it's all about enabling the continued existence of the purely
Pure
human,
human.
as
Yeah.
opposed
So
to that chicken head, right? And the derogatory term that's meant to um,
denigrate them. That's
denigrate mentally disabled folk, right?
right. So
But
what's,
but listen to chicken head. What also is significant about that, right? It blurs the lines between what human and animals play a special role in this world, as we'll talk
yeah.
about. But go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah, no, so that's so the immigration to Mars, right, is
right.
limited. Not everybody can do it. If you
No.
are in any way affected, and to leave, you have to be tested to leave to pass this
Oh,
purity test, right?
right, right,
So we have a character, Isidore, J.R. Isidore, who is not able to leave. So
right.
what happens is people emigrate to Mars, where they have a better, cleaner, purer, easier life. And so the work that's done on Mars,
Except that it's still hard,
it's
and
very
you
hard
need
because, again, because it's not natural or real in terms of what
or
we have here. So the androids, there's this android industry, right, where they do the physical labor that humans would be unable to undertake on Mars, but they also perform a series of service roles as well. So it's like
yeah.
you get the tractor and the butler all in one. And the problem is that,
That's very good.
you
That's
like that?
exactly right. Yeah.
That's why I'm a
You're the
professional,
vacuum
Barry.
cleaner and you're also the caretaker.
That's
It's all
exactly it.
good. It's all
Um,
good.
so the problem is every so often, a number of these androids will rebel. And
Right.
in rebelling, they will kill their human overlords
Sure.
and then try and sneak back to Earth. And that then introduces our protagonist, Decker, who is a
Rick
police.
Deckard, who is a
He's a
bounty
bounty
hunter, right?
hunter who doesn't officially exist, right? Like the bounty hunters don't officially
Right. Right.
exist because androids don't officially exist on Earth.
Mhm.
So he's sort of this shadow character who hunts down and retires or kills any androids that are able to escape Mars and come back. And
Mhm.
so the basic argument here is that these are machines, the androids are machines that are self-aware. They know that what they've done is against the law on Mars, and so they flee and they are seeking survival here. And so the question about what's real and what's not at this point is still fairly cleanly divided, right?
Mhm.
These are machines that know that they have killed a other, the
Mhm.
human, and
Mhm.
they are running from that to live here. So basically, to this point, if we stop the story here,
Mhm.
I think that, PKD and Turkle are still compatible in the
Mhm.
sense that
Mhm.
there's been no sort of challenge to, he hasn't issued anything that challenges what she says. But then what's interesting is that you see the androids sort of working together for their survival,
Right.
um, which you could argue is sort of some sort of mathematic probabilistic conclusion, like we're better together than we are separately. Um, I want to start the discussion here with a
Mhm.
scene from the story where so the book starts. Decker has been he's the
Mhm.
second in
Mhm.
he's the second ranking bounty hunter. The
Mhm.
first bounty hunter was tasked with retiring six new versions of androids,
Right.
and one almost gets him. And so he's in
Right.
the hospital and he's not coming out anytime soon. So the job falls to Decker. And the first thing he does is he flies from Seattle, or excuse me, from San Francisco to Seattle to meet with the makers or the
Of the
manufacturers
new
of the
of the new
new
right.
androids.
The new Android line.
And he meets Rachel.
Mhm.
And the very first thing that happens, I'm just going to spoil it for everybody. So hit mute real quick if you don't know the story. Go read the story, watch the movie, come back. Rachel is an android, and
Mhm.
she is put in front of him to see if he can distinguish her from a functioning from a human. And it nearly happens, right? So
Yes.
this question, I like,
Well, he
I
administers the test. Are you
yes.
going to talk
So
about
okay.
that?
So yeah, that's the last thing I was listening. So the way that the bounty hunters are able to distinguish
Mhm.
between human and android
Mhm.
is that, like Turkle, who says that the distinction is emotionally based, that machines can't emote.
There's an oral test.
There is an oral test that measures the emotional quality or content of the recipient. And the way that androids are found out is that they do not have a human appropriate response. And
And by human appropriate, you mean, as you've been implying, emotional, affective,
correct, correct. So
empathetic.
right. So in earlier versions with the more primitive versions of the
It was
androids,
very easy to tell.
very easy. You say something like, "Hey, we're having a lunch of boiled dog or something," and a human
And you say,
rear
would say,
back in
I don't want
revulsion.
boiled dog. That's
Right.
crazy. I know I'm human because I don't like boiled dog. But with the new form of AI, all of a sudden, what? All of a sudden, they seem to be able to. This is something that maybe isn't very clear in the book, or at least not clear to me. What is it? This new AI? Did they learn to be more devious
Well, so here's the question,
or
and this.
more able to conceal their
So
motives? What is that?
because no, I think that the answer is more contextual, and I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
context that speaks to Turkle. And so maybe this is the first step, right?
Okay.
Decker asks Rachel a series of questions,
Mm-hmm.
and they range from everything to what is sexually appropriate,
Mm-hmm.
to what is socially appropriate,
Mm-hmm.
to what would be what just like a humane response to
Humane
things.
response to things, right?
And she does not pass the test with flying colors. And he questions her about some of her responses, but her answer is that I wasn't born here, right? That she was
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be on she was the result of a very long trip that had to come back. And so her reason for not crushing the empathy test, for passing it with flying colors,
Mm-hmm.
is not so much that she's a perfectly function that she's a machine who's now able to create an empathetic response. It's that she's masquerading as a human who was never given traditional human context in which to operate.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And so,
Already, Dick is blurring that line
and I'm
between
one,
the human
but
and the android,
so,
right?
but they come to different responses here, right? Like Turkle's argument about this was that we're so reliant on technologies
Mm-hmm.
that we don't learn, it's no longer natural for us to engage interpersonally, that there's always this mediated
Mm-hmm.
thing or mediating thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of its lack of humanity, we lose our lack of humanity. Um,
We lose our human.
but it makes things more efficient. It makes things faster and easier. So we lean into it more. Dick is arguing now that, hey, humanity has reached this point where we are alienated. And that alienation isn't so much the result of that alienation isn't so much a situation where the androids are
Hmm.
now more able to be human, It's that we have a context where humans are less able
Oh yeah,
to be
right,
human.
right. It's a great point.
And
It's
so
great.
that's sort of a reverse blurring of the lines. But um,
That's a
yeah,
great point. Let me just linger on the test. That's a great point. Um, and that does definitely PKD is a sort of approaching the human android dyad. I won't say binary because he's trying to figure out the two things. He's not trying to make a hierarchical distinction between the two things. He's trying to inquire into the ontology of both of the categories, each of the categories. But let me add something. Let me linger a little bit on the tests that you were mentioning. I think one of the things that we're at the very beginning of the novel, really proper. We have this extended scene of interrogation where Deckard is interrogating Rachel, trying to figure out, trying to prove, trying to establish her humanity or lack of it. And I think that a couple things are shown to the reader, and that Dick is trying to indicate a couple things to the reader in this extensive scene. I'm going to say a couple things, and you tell me whether you agree. So, one of the things I think he's showing is the stakes of having a test. And I think this speaks to what you were saying, Michael, about uh, the new spiritual state of humanity in this novel. Here's kind of this test, whether or not this test works, the test that proves without a shadow of a doubt that androids are androids. The stakes for this are very high. I'll try and enumerate some of the stakes. One of the stakes is this.
murder.
Well, yes, murder, but not simply murder. I mean, or rather, it's related to that. It's a distinction between murder and killing. And
Yes.
let me see if I can let me go back just a second and see if I can make this plain to myself and to others. So what seems to be at stake in the test? I think a lot of it. And the test, I think one of the reasons why PKD lingers on the test and kind of uses the test to establish Deckard's worldview and the dominant worldview in this particular society is because everything really depends on the test. So the test is ideologically really important because the stakes couldn't be higher. If you this test, if the test is valid, you live in a morally unambiguous world. And that's what these characters, because they're not able really, we're not shown that they're able to deal with moral complexity at all, right? There seems to be a de-evolution of consciousness in that state. So the test is really important because one of the important things of knowing for sure that the android is an android is that it allows you a good conscience to kill the android. So that the killing, I stumbled when you mentioned the word murder because really that's at stake in the test. If you're killing an android, it's not murder. In fact, it's not even killing. It's
Retiring.
deactivation.
It's
It's
deactivation.
retiring. It's a technical, formal, bureaucratic process.
Right.
So the test is ideologically really, really crucial because if the test is falsifiable, then you have to make a life or death decision. If you can rely on the test, you live in a morally unambiguous world, a clear black and white world where you can just do your duty and not have to engage your brain because you're not murdering anything. You're not even killing anything. You're just deactivating / retiring a device. But the failure of the test so much hinges on the failure of the test or the possible potential failure of the test and the potential development of a new line of AI. What's at stake? Well, all of a sudden you have to have a conscience. All of a sudden, in fact, that's basically the process that we see that Deckard is into. He is given, he becomes a person who, I'm not saying he does the right thing or he's a moral exemplar. I think PKD suggests that he's not a moral exemplar. But nonetheless, beginning with this scene, Rick Deckard, I almost called him RKD. That's not right. Deckard has to wrestles with his emerging conscious. He has a developing moral conscious, and he starts to having qualms and ambiguous feelings and contradictory feelings, which freak him the f out. Right? He doesn't want to have that. Again, this test matters a lot because if the test is real, if we can rely on it, then we're not killing anything, we're deactivating things. And Deckard is really nostalgic for that world. But PKD is forcing him to understand that maybe it's not as damn simple as he wants to believe, and as the rest of society, the rest of this particular world wants to believe. That perhaps when you're deactivating an android, you're killing
Mm-hmm.
someone or something or some being. So can be huger stakes. So in other words, we've been talking about Dick wrestling with the larger question of the real, what's real and what's simulation. Here, that question has very real stakes in that the being unable to distinguish the difference between the android, the robotic, and the human means that humans now become murderers instead of technical functionaries, instead of bounty hunters who are doing bloodless work. They have blood on their hands, or they
Mm-hmm.
potentially have blood on their hands. Well, that's so all of a sudden we have the introduction of ethics and ethical choice making in Deckard's life and in the world of this novel.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that, he starts us out there with this idea that this is a truly the highest stakes, right? But it's interesting because this search for certainty comes down to something that is still, in essence, mathematically determined, right? Like each answer
Exactly,
gets
exactly.
scored a number. So to
Right,
me,
right,
I
right.
think, and I kind of want to do, I think maybe the best way of looking at this, because I don't think it's in our best interest to try and recount every instance of this, just a quick gloss of the way this works, right? Like if you think about what are the human constructs, what do we have that manifests what it is to be human in the world? Okay. So we have art, right? We have music, we have love, sex, right? The ability to empathize. These are the places where he places the androids, right? So the story
Right.
goes that there are 6 androids that that have come to Earth, right? The first one that Deckard retires is masquerading as a police officer, right?
Mhm.
We have a second character that
Law, a human
law,
institution.
right?
Law. No, I like what you're doing. Let's tick it off.
So we
Law.
have we have
So we have an
one,
android
we have
who is a
Polakov who,
wonderful police enforcer, right?
right,
Yeah.
but at the same time we have a second, probably maybe human, maybe android who saves Deckard's life from another android who may or may not be an android and admits to as much. I don't think I am, but maybe I am. So that essential question of what am I,
Right.
you hear out of this. The one of the androids that they retire is an opera singer,
Right.
and they
Realm
get
of
her.
culture representing, let's fill it out,
Yes,
representing the realm of culture
right.
and art, which
So
is supremely human.
right now she knows she's an android. She knows it,
And she's a great artist. What
but
does
she
that
is a
mean?
renowned musician, an opera singer,
Singer.
and they apprehend her and ultimately retire her in a museum after buying her a book of art.
In fact, she's killed. This is very important. She's killed in cold blood.
Yes,
She's
yes,
not given the test,
no,
right?
no. She is, by any account, she is killed, not
She is
deactivated,
she is
right?
not deactivated. She is killed.
Then you have the
And
interest.
Deckard sees this.
Yeah.
Deckard doesn't do it, but he sees this.
Well, and the other interesting thing to note, just to for, to pick up the fragments of these arguments, in situations where an android is retired, they run a bone marrow test,
Right.
right? So it is not an electronic diagnostic here. It is a surgical procedure, right?
And
So he's blurring these lines.
and Dick at every point, I mean, what you're pointing out is that Dick at every point adds a layer of complexity. I wanted to add this to the bone marrow test. here's the thing about the bone marrow test. That'll give you definitive results. But in doing so, you're going to kill whatever it is. If it's a human or an android, it's likely the bone marrow test that could definitively prove it is probably going to kill them regardless of what you're doing. So there's a reluctance to do the test. So because they're reluctant to administer this particular test that could actually prove without a doubt the ontology of the being they're investigating. And therefore, but it's often a test too far. So they're forced to rely on a test that gives uncertain results. And so, like it or not, Deckard has to live with the full moral force of this. He has to live and do his work in this morally gray, ambiguous territory.
Yeah. So then we move to the rest. So the other three huddled together. So the story, right? Like Deckard's superior got one. Polikoff was the cop, was number two. The opera singer was number three. So the other three androids, huddled together, right? Well, what happens is one of the so-called chicken heads, a human, right, falls, develops an emotional attachment. You could argue falls in love, sort of, with one of these androids who, oddly enough, is the exact same model as the Rachel character.
So in a way, Isidore and Deckard are in love with an android.
Absolutely.
With the same android, even.
With exactly
arguably,
different imprints of the same android.
Imprints of the same android.
Deckard goes so far as to break the law and sleeps with Rachel. Right. So you have actual, and this is something that in Alone Together, that Turkle argues is just a step too far. You can't be sleeping with the robots. But here we see it, and there's not really. I mean, correct me tell me if you have a different read here, but Deckard doesn't really have the emotional, ethical quandary, problem, riddle. Like, there's no hurdle for him to clear with that.
No.
And there is no scene. There is no relation with his wife. There's not even really a hint that this is important to him with his human wife. So, we've got this question of emotional attachment that maybe extends to beyond, sort of affection into the boundaries of love with Isidore. You certainly cross the line into physical interaction, sex with Deckard. And then the last thing, which I find interesting here, is that morality is religion, religion is something that is essentially mechanized with Mercerism.
Enabled through the empathy box, which allows the participants to have this mystical vision of Mercer who seems to be a character. We see Mercer trying to climb a mountain, and they're in the middle of a avalanche of rocks, and the viewer of this simulation, the participant in this simulation, experiences vicariously a sympathy with the suffering of Mercer.
Right. But all of your emotional connections are mediated,
being prompted by a technological device,
determined, manipulated in such a way that you can, like the book starts when Deckard's leaving the house. He says to his wife, "Oh, you shouldn't be dialing in despair. You should be dialing up, a different sort of worldview for the day." And so I think that what PKD is doing is really going to great lengths to say, look, all of your human all of the things that are the markers of sort of consciousness and humanity, what it means to be, what is at the core of the human experience, all run through circuitry. I mean, this is all roboticized. And all of the things that we tend to look at and say, well, these are clearly androids. These are the machines. This is the work of machines. All have the hallmarks, like that they are inscribed with human characteristics. So I almost feel like PKD's response to Turkle is like, yeah, I see where you're going. I see where you want to go with this stark division.
but we
but
can't
those
do it.
divisions aren't there.
If we can, and moreover, um, yeah, well, you put it well. He understands, PKD understands the need to do what Turkle does, to find and articulate a clear dividing line between the humans and the androids. But what the novel does, and you just mentioned like tons of plot points, and we could be here all day adding plot points, but these plot points all contribute, all work to the similar effect. They all break down and they all encourage the reader to be skeptical of these moments when the characters or events seem to suggest, aha, we found it. This is the dividing line. This is what distinguishes a human from an android. We can now proceed in a clear, unambiguous territory with clear, unambiguous knowledge that we have marked the difference or distinction between the human and the android.
So I have a
And
question for you. I have a
yes.
question for you because I think that this is, in a way, all preamble to a very specific point. We talked about this
Hmm.
earlier before we started recording. Um, we haven't mentioned at all the electric sheep or the importance of
Hmm.
animals, right? So
Hmm.
these are um, this is central, I think, and I think there's one scene in particular that we need to try and figure out what sort of what's going on.
Let's do it.
So Deckard has an electric sheep. Deckard has an electric sheep to start the story, right? And his neighbor has sort of horse,
I think so.
right? That's
The
real.
plot point
And,
is the plot point is eluding me, but it sounds right.
right. And so Deckard is very jealous of this. And the ownership of an animal, I think, is both it's about status, right?
It's very
And
much
so
about class status.
authenticity is obviously an elevated status, right? But it's also supposed to provide some
Well,
sort,
Michael, I think I have to interrupt you just to do
yeah,
one bit of plot setup that I don't think you, and I don't know, this isn't so much a spoiler as a necessary part of the plot setup. One of the reasons why animals can be a status symbol is because most of them died off in the war and
yes,
the problem of radiation. So that's created a problem of scarcity.
yes,
That's the background in which all the things that you're about to talk about make sense.
right.
So
Sorry.
in this idea, no, I'm just want to set that up because now that's going to give the necessary resonance to what you're talking about.
So possession, these animals are status symbols, but there's also in that status sort of an emotional construct at play
Indeed,
here, right?
indeed.
And
You
so
prove you prove, and yeah, it isn't just class status, it's also you prove your humanity in a
right,
word,
by being
right?
able to care
Right.
for and connect with this thing. So you have an interesting situation. Deckard has a sheep, which almost disgusts him in the sense it matters, but he's disappointed in it, right? Because it's not
This
real.
is
And
electric.
his neighbor's got a
I'm not
horse.
really caring for an animal, I'm caring for a simulacra. That doesn't count.
No, this is keeping up with the Joneses, is all it is. He's
Right,
playing his part.
right.
And then, so there's that. Deckard, or excuse me, Isidore, the chicken head who befriends the androids,
Right.
realizes they're androids, doesn't care. So for him, the distinction between, he does not have an animal, but he works as a technician for a fake animal hospital that will come and get your fake animal and bring it to the hospital and do repairs on it, all under the guise of being authentic. He ends up picking up a real cat that is sick, can't distinguish between the real cat and a mechanical cat. Um, and so the cat dies. That's neither here nor there, I think, for where I'm going with this. The point is, Deckard, after retiring a number of the androids, realizes he's going to have a pretty substantial payday for the bounties
I
and
can afford a
buys
real animal now.
and he buys a goat. And this is big time. He's got a real live goat, right? And so he gets it, he brings it home. I'm just going to spoil it for everybody. While he's off retiring the last three androids after having sex with Rachel, while he's gone, Rachel comes to his apartment and pushes the goat off the building, killing the goat. And that leaves us with this giant, what in the hell is that about moment? Because I think that is really that moment, that scene
Like,
is
why does
really, really,
Rachel,
what's
yeah,
that?
why does Rachel kill the goat?
Why would Rachel do such a thing?
Mhm.
Why would you push a goat off? Because there's a couple different reads for it, but they all are really leaning into her being a creature with feelings. She's a jealous, jilted lover. She's angry that her friends have been retired. There's a number of ways to read this, and I'm curious as to how you like how do you look at this?
Well, as you know, I kind of struggled with this passage because it seemed as if it was as if PKD was sort of tipping the balance. In the rest of the novel, he seemed to be suggesting it's really hard, in fact, impossible, to truly distinguish, truly accomplish what Deckard desperately strives to do, which is find a way to distinguish between the human and the android. So he can just go about and make some money and do his work without qualms of conscience. So throughout the novel, there is a sense that, well, uh, maybe it isn't as simple, this idea that, well, androids don't have empathy, humans do. So by process of observation or elimination, we can figure out who has empathy and who doesn't, and therefore we can distinguish between the species. Dick is always complicating that. You mentioned the opera singer, and that's a perfect example of that. Here's somebody who is able to, who through her art is able to move other humans. Deckard is a fan of the opera singer, we're told.
Hmm.
So we have an android who is able to move the consciousness or move the emotions of humans. So at every point, when we think, okay, androids shouldn't be able to do that, at every point, Dick seems to be complicating, making it difficult for us to distinguish between the human and the android. In this moment, and one of the reasons, as I told you, that this scene troubles me, this passage that you reference, Rachel uh, acting out of revenge and killing Deckard's goat. It troubled me because it seemed to suggest, okay, he's tipping the balance here. PKD is tipping the balance here. Turns out androids don't have empathy at all. But then you help me with this. On further reflection, upon reflection, I realized that this episode, I think, yet again, it is true to the formula of the book, the dynamic of the book, and that it shows you that androids are incredibly human, and that they have an emotional, affective response that sometimes doesn't look like caretaking or artistic creativity, but it is human or a simulacra of the human nonetheless. In that in that there's she seems to be acting out of, as you suggest, um, uh, her actions seem to be emotionally motivated, as you
Hmm.
were suggesting. She
Right.
seems to be acting out of friendship, comrade, sisterly feeling for her fallen comrades, or out of feeling jilted and used by humans. Not just Deckard. We're also told that Rachel was programmed to sleep with humans and sort of seduce bounty hunters, and distract them from doing their work. So it seems like she's going against her programming in a very human way. So yet again, this episode, I think, hews to the other episodes, or sort of reinforces the lesson of the other episodes, I think, that it's difficult, in fact, impossible to really distinguish between humans and androids when viewed as when viewed through by using the emotional litmus test. Right.
So I have a question, and maybe this is sort of the off ramp from this discussion here. But when we started out today, you had mentioned that PKD is dealing with two central questions, right? One being, where's the dividing line between the human and the machine?
Mm-hmm.
And two, what is real, right? And what constitutes the real?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm thinking about the scene here with the opera singer,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the fact that she was able to create, or I guess as a singer, reproduce um, art that was affective, that moved people, that had that power. And you think about what happens with Rachel, being programmed to seduce bounty hunters, right? A
Mm-hmm.
machine seducing humans. The ability to, what I guess in order for her to be able to do that, she has to
Mm-hmm.
produce something that a human is going to respond to, right?
Mm-hmm.
In order for the opera singer to be successful, and we know that she is a world famous opera singer, she has to be
Luba
successful.
left. We'll give her a name.
Luba
Right.
left, thank
Luba
you.
left.
So I guess the question that I have is, what's to go back, Turkle says that any sort of anything that looks like emotion is algorithmically generated, and it
Mm-hmm.
is only emotional insofar as humans are willing to fool themselves. And here we have a number of instances littered throughout the book, scattered throughout the book, where the androids display profoundly compelling versions
Of
of
humanity, of
of
human emotion.
humanity.
Right.
That's
Right.
like humanity is a good word there. So that are real in the sense that they either fool us or we allow ourselves to be fooled, us being humans. Um, what's the value of the real? I mean, are we I think about that scene in The Matrix where the guy is eating the steak in the restaurant
Mm-hmm.
and he
Mm-hmm.
says, I don't care if the
Mm-hmm.
steak is real. I don't care that this is part of a program. It
Mm-hmm.
tastes real. It feels real.
Mm-hmm.
And when I live in the real that is that cramped ship and just the situation of what real humanity looks like, I'm totally happy with this simulation. I look at this and I'm wondering what is what is the value of the real? Because to me, Turkle seems really hung up on this. And PKD's response is sort of like, you're going to burn yourself out and run yourself into the ground, and all you're doing essentially is denying yourself the experience of the real.
Hmm. Well, I'd put it a little bit different way, but I think you're right. I think we are at the point where we can take the off ramp and the end the episode because I think we've described uh, the plot events and what the plot event and what philosophical conclusion I think PKD wants us to reach by working through the plot events of the novel. And so I think we're right to say what does PK do? This is a good point to ask. What does PK do? What is PKD's response in a way to Turkle's idea that and so do you want me to take an
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know if
yeah.
I can directly answer. Maybe in the process I'll directly answer your question about the value of the real. Um, but I'll try to answer your question in coming at it from a slight tangent, because I think you are asking, and I'll try to answer the question rather. Start again. I'll try to answer the question in relation and bring Turkle into the answer to that question. Okay. Uh, Turkle seems very confident in a word or two or a sentence or two. Try and keep this limited. Turkle seems confident, or at least hopeful, that in the time of crisis for humanity, and the crisis, as you are already suggesting, the crisis for humanity is at the crossroad for Turkle, is that with the introduction of AI, the introduction of AI is happening in a moment in human society when human relationships are already in danger because of our reliance on mediation. Nonetheless, Turk Turkle is hopeful that humans can rally and recover their emotional metal or emotional resources. And it's important for Turkle that humans do so because what's at stake, because finally, in the last analysis, AI doesn't have emotions. And so, but humans are powerfully emotional and effective and have an effective core. And so we need to find and recover however we can do so. And she's hopeful we can, that we can find ways of reestablishing, say, direct communicate, maybe through by reasserting modes of direct communication between humans. We can sort of tap into our so far underutilized, dangerously underutilized capacities for emotional, for bonding, for communal bonding. And she's very optimistic about it. And she's also optimistic that at core, yes, you can scratch. Yes, you can scratch the itch. Yes, you can obfuscate the question. But there is a core difference between humans and androids, humans and AI, and it relies in the emotional. And I think PKD, in at every turn, in every respect, is anticipating this kind of binary choice or humanity's dilemma and saying at every point, the more you want to solve the problem and find a definitive answer for this question, the harder that question is going to be, the more you're going to actually muddy up the end. You're not going to find a solution just because you want or desperately desire a solution. The problem is always going to be muddy. It's always going to be a fine line and a question of ambiguity, and in fact, finally indeterminate, unable to determine the distinction between the human and the android. I think that's where PKD comes in.
I agree. I want to add one thing to it because I think you hit it. It's almost as if he's looking at this idea of empathy or emotion and saying, wow, this is such an incredibly fragile, indeterminate thing
Malleable,
because
malleable as
it is.
well.
Because
Yeah,
if you think about it, right? If you take the empathy test, if you ask enough questions,
you're going to
you can,
show that you don't have enough.
but you're going to screw it up eventually.
You're
You're
going to
going to
screw it
give the
up.
wrong
Right,
answer, right?
right,
But we
right.
also see this idea, if you go back to, and this is maybe, no, I think this is right. Think about Clara and the Sun again, right? There's that question of, can you map Josie's heart? And she's like, wow, it's complicated, but with enough time, yeah, I can map Josie's heart. I can be the emotion. I can be the emotional equivalent of
Mhm.
this human being, that it can be done. And if you think about, you know, the character of Rachel in this story, right? In the right context, you will get something that is, I think, I don't know that we can pin down what the emotional response is, but
Mhm.
killing that goat is an emotional
Is it?
response.
Yeah, right, exactly,
And
exactly. That's
so
what I'm trying to,
I
you very nicely said what I was trying to say earlier, that whatever seems to be the motivation, it does seem to tie back to this idea of an emotional core of the android.
mhm. Well, there you go.
Well, Michael, one more. Well, no, I felt I interrupted you. Well,
No,
first
no,
off, I
no.
felt I interrupted you.
I was, I think what I was just trying to say, uh, and I think it's been said now, is that Turkle draws this line like, "Hey, we can't do this,"
Right.
right? That
We
that
got
she'll
to go
never
back.
be.
We got to recover. We got to
But
recover something here.
I
Yeah.
think that what Dick is saying is that a lot of this is contextual. A lot of this is good. The very nature of emotion is, how do I want to say it? The idea, the nature of emotion, I think, is maybe the best way of saying is it's a reciprocal, it's an interaction.
Very good.
and
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
that the results of this interaction are always going to be unique to the interaction. And because you are in
Wonderful
fact
point.
interacting with these machines,
Wonderful point.
the distinction between what's what's real and what's not
Mhm.
is virtually impossible.
Right, 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 right. Okay. I think we have reached closure. Allow me, and I promise I won't take too long. I promise. I always say this, but I promise I won't take too long. I just wanted to linger just one more moment or two with PKD
Sure.
and sort of draw another line. Um, okay, I think we've addressed. I especially love your last point. I think we've addressed PKD's response, so to speak, to Turkle's problem and solution, to the problems and solutions that Turkle was offering and raising and offering in Alone Together. I wanted to linger as sort of in a closing remark about PKD. So what we've been saying throughout this episode is that PKD kind of retains a core of skepticism, that basically he's always asking this question. And then I think encouraging, always asking the question of how can we determine the difference? How can we determine? How can we define the human? And at every point in the novel, I think we've been saying, uh, he encourages the reader to be skeptical and open minded about achieving a definitive answer and to resist finding a definitive answer, a definitive set of criteria that would allow us, no matter how much we strive or urge, or no matter our urgency, no matter our felt need for finding this criteria, I think PKD is offering us the uncomfortable lesson that, you know, we may want to find that dividing line. We may want to find the magic test that's going to determine who's human and who's not. But we need to resist that tendency. So I think that's kind of the upshot. We've been saying that's the upshot of the book. I wanted to close by saying, okay, you know, skeptical philosophy, there's always the question that skeptical philosophy offers, which is, yeah, well, you're just telling me to stay unresolved, living in this unresolved things. I mean, what am I supposed to do? I know you're telling me it's difficult to intellectually determine, but that's not very helpful. I can imagine a reader saying, I don't want to be skeptical PKD. I want to be like Sherry Turkle, or I want to be somebody else. I want to have an answer. What's the answer to this question you're posing? It's a good question. Thank you, PKD, for articulating it. What's the effing answer? I need to know, because I need to know, what am I going to do? I'm facing AI right now. I'm forced to use AI in my work. There are all these urgencies that make us want to have an answer and not be comfortable with the skeptical, well, how do we know? How can we ever know? I would just say, in conclusion, that the skeptical position that PKD is articulating, I think there is an ethics behind it. It is he's not just saying, well, we'll never know. Let's fold up our hands and bracket off the question indefinitely. I don't think that's the purpose of his skeptical take, or of encouraging us to be skeptical about finding definitive answers. I think his purpose is to keep us questioning and open ended. So, in other words, the right way to answer the question of, is Dr. Rapici human? Is Dr. Falk human? The question is, the proper question, the proper answer to that question is not, well, I don't know if Dr. Rapici is human, but I'm working on a test that's going to establish it to me and to all the rest of humanity for once and all.
Okay.
I think the skeptical answer that PKD is positing to that question of, how can I determine whether Dr. Rapici is human, is that you wait and see. You wait, you defer judgment. You defer judgment that we have to prove that we're human, but then we have to allow each other space to prove our humanity, because that's all we can do. That's all we're doing every day, is we're proving whether or not we're human. At any point in the process, if I asked you, or I'll ask me, since I don't want to
Oh,
be
no,
picking
no, no.
on my hypothetical.
There are a lot of students who wonder this question.
Well, I'm just saying that at no point can we prove our humanity. All we can do is act as if we're human. That's all anything or anyone can do, is act toward a kind of humanity. I think the the philosophical answer to the question of, can you determine criteria? The answer is no, you can't determine any intellectual valid criteria. But that doesn't mean, I don't think Piketty is saying, let's fold our hands. I think he's saying we need to defer that question. We need to wait and see. And more important, we need to prove our ontology by what we do, right?
So the logical question that follows from this, then, there's two. One, is then humanity simply performative, or does the answer to that lie?
I think PK, well,
right. And then the second one
yeah,
is the answer to this something that you could then just wait out, right? So, for example, in the book, the androids have a lifespan of what? 4 years?
Yeah.
So you can literally wait the machine out and say, oh, I waited long enough.
You could. And that's not an option. That's never part of the horizon of expectation in this novel. That's not part of the conversation.
No.
Because people want definitive answers. And they want to act on it because it's politically motivated.
Sure.
So in the world of the novel, the answer to that question is no. But just because the answer is no in this particular world doesn't mean that that is the absolute correct answer. It just means that in this particular, obviously troubled and problematic society, they don't allow this kind of opening. There's no room for this kind of open-ended exploration. I don't think that invalidates the question.
No, but it's troubling because in the search for humanity, if you ask enough questions, you're gonna screw it up. You're gonna prove yourself non-human.
But then that means that we're always under investigation. We should always be trying to administer I think this is Piketty's. We should always be asking ourselves this. And at certain points, we're going to realize that we're failing the test.
Okay.
Well, anyway, I'm just.
I mean, it's not.
I'm not trying to offer a definitive reading for you or for me, but I am saying,
no,
I'm
but
trying
that last
to answer
bit,
the resistance. Yeah.
But that last bit about the inevitability of failure, if you read it that way, it is really an interesting fatalistic condemnation of the future of humanity in a world dominated by AI.
In this world, right?
Which mimics a lot of the fears we have today, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Falk, thank you for that uplifting ray of sunshine.
Well, I sense you're saying uplifting ray of sunshine as if in an ironic way, but honestly, I did mean this as a kind of life-affirming
because you can
ray of sunshine, huh?
Because you can wait it out.
Yeah, because I think that PKD assumes that the way, yes, that and that we, in normal circumstances, we should have the freedom. Everybody should have the freedom. Everyone should be allowed to wait it out. And if we don't have that freedom, then I think PKD would say, shouldn't we question why we don't have that freedom? Why are we not allowing that?
Not only that, I'm going to amend my sarcasm here and actually say, additionally, even if we no longer retain our humanity, it is still possible to act as a human. And
to imitate it.
There is optimism
absolutely.
there.
Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly it.
Okay.
Good place, Dan.
It is an emotional roller coaster of an episode today.
This is the emotional roller coaster episode.
Well, Barry, this was good. I enjoyed this. Hope you guys did too. And let us know what you think.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Apici. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr.
Much appreciated.
Have a lovely day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.